The ripple effect of a Saturday afternoon. It was a bustling Saturday afternoon at the Sunhaven Galleria, the kind of day where life seemed to pulse through the corridors of the sprawling shopping center. Shoppers darted in and out of stores, children tugged at their parents' hands, and the aroma of freshly baked pretzels mingled with the scent of designer perfumes. Amidst the hum of activity, 34-year-old Naomi Ellis moved with quiet purpose. Her simple outfit of a cardigan, jeans, and sneakers spoke of comfort, not fashion, a reflection of her practical personality. Naomi wasn't there to shop. She was there to observe. As a freelance journalist and writer, she often found inspiration in the small, unnoticed moments of life. That day, she had set out to capture the essence of the mall's dynamic, a snapshot of humanity in all its glorious messiness. Armed with her notepad and pen, Naomi sat on a bench in the atrium, jotting down details of the scene. A toddler's delighted laugh, a barista's warm smile, the rhythm of footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. She had no way of knowing her afternoon would soon shift from peaceful observation to a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the walls of the mall. Naomi leaned back, letting the bustle of the crowd fade into background noise. She was midway through sketching the scene of a young couple arguing over scented candles when a voice pierced the air, cutting through her thoughts like a jagged knife. "Excuse me, do you even belong here?" The words were sharp, tinged with a condescension that turned heads. Naomi looked up, startled. Standing before her was a woman in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer, her heels clicking against the floor as she shifted her weight. She held a designer purse tightly against her side, her gaze fixed on Naomi like she was something unpleasant that had been left on the bench. Naomi blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry." The woman's lips curled into a faint sneer. "You heard me. People like you shouldn't be loitering here. This is a place for shoppers, not for whatever it is you're doing." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the sharpness of the woman's tone. Naomi felt the weight of curious stares pressing in on her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not loitering," Naomi said evenly. "I'm just sitting here." The woman huffed, crossing her arms. "Sitting, loitering, same difference. And I suppose you're waiting for someone to hand you something. Or maybe you're just here to make people uncomfortable." Naomi's heart clenched, but she refused to let the woman's words fluster her. Instead, she straightened her back and looked the woman in the eye. "Ma'am, I think you've made a mistake." The woman laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "I doubt it. People like you stick out like a sore thumb in places like this." Naomi wasn't naive. She understood what people like you meant. It wasn't about her outfit, her presence, or even her actions. It was about the color of her skin and the assumptions that followed. The mall's atmosphere shifted, the usual hum of activity replaced by a quiet tension as more onlookers slowed their steps to watch. "You don't know me," Naomi said, her voice steady but firm. "You don't know why I'm here or who I am, yet you've already decided you're entitled to judge me. Why is that?" The woman's expression hardened. "Because I've seen this before. People loitering, causing trouble, taking advantage of spaces meant for paying customers." "Loitering," Naomi repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "I'm sitting on a bench, in a public space, minding my own business. That's hardly a crime." The woman's gaze swept over Naomi again, her expression dismissive. "Maybe it's not a crime, but it's certainly inappropriate. You're making people uncomfortable." Naomi's stomach churned, but she kept her composure. "Uncomfortable? Or are you projecting your own discomfort onto others?" The confrontation might have ended there, if not for the growing crowd. A teenager with a phone held it up, the camera pointed squarely at the unfolding drama. Whispers rippled through the small group of spectators, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and for some, agreement with the woman's words. Naomi noticed the murmurs, the camera, and the widening circle of onlookers. She realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger, the chance to confront the kind of prejudice that lingered just beneath the surface of polite society. Taking a deep breath, Naomi rose from the bench. At 5'6", she wasn't particularly imposing, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that demanded attention. "If you have something to say, ma'am, say it plainly," Naomi said. "Let everyone hear exactly what you mean." The woman's confident facade faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I mean that people like you, people who don't belong here, shouldn't make it harder for the rest of us to enjoy these spaces." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Naomi caught the eye of a young mother holding a toddler. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their silence speaking volumes. "People like me," Naomi repeated, her voice steady. "You mean people who look like me?" The woman's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Naomi replied. A silence settled over the atrium, thick and heavy. Naomi felt the weight of every gaze in the crowd, but she didn't shrink away. Instead, she stepped closer to the woman, her voice firm but calm. "You see me sitting here and assume the worst. You don't ask who I am, what I do, or why I'm here. You don't see me as a person, you see a stereotype." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The crowd leaned in, their collective attention now fully focused on the exchange. "And for what?" Naomi continued. "To make yourself feel superior, to protect some imagined sense of order in a public space. What exactly are you so afraid of?" The woman blinked, taken aback. For the first time, her polished demeanor began to crack. She glanced around, searching for support, but the crowd's expressions offered none. "I'm not afraid," the woman said finally, though her voice wavered. You just what?" Naomi pressed. "You see someone different and decide they don't belong. Is that it?" The tension in the air was palpable, but Naomi knew this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about creating an opportunity for understanding, for growth. "Let me tell you something," Naomi said, her voice softer now. "You're not the first person to judge me based on nothing but assumptions, and you won't be the last. But every time it happens, I have a choice, to let it break me or to stand up and show people like you that I'm more than what you see." The crowd murmured in agreement, a subtle but powerful shift in their collective stance. Even the woman seemed to waver, her posture less rigid, her expression less certain. Naomi took a step back, her voice carrying across the atrium. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Every time we let fear or prejudice guide our actions, we build walls between ourselves and others. But what if, instead, we chose to see each other as people, flawed, complex, and worthy of respect?" The woman's gaze dropped to the floor, her silence speaking louder than any words could. And with that, Naomi sat back down on the bench, her heart pounding but her spirit unbroken. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the background hum of the mall. The teenage boy lowered his phone, his expression contemplative. As Naomi watched the woman retreat into the crowd, she knew the moment was far from over. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a chance for something greater to grow from the ashes of a painful encounter. The unseen struggles behind assumptions. The encounter in the Sunhaven Gallery's atrium had rippled through Naomi's mind for hours after it ended. She'd walked away from the mall feeling equal parts victorious and heavy-hearted. Confronting prejudice was never easy, but the emotional toll of doing so lingered long after the adrenaline faded. Still, Naomi knew she hadn't had much of a choice. Moments like these demanded action, not just for herself, but for anyone who might one day find themselves in her shoes. The following morning, Naomi settled into her small home office. Her desk was cluttered with notebooks, sticky notes, and her laptop, all testaments to her ongoing projects as a freelance journalist. Normally, this was her sanctuary, a place where words flowed freely and ideas transformed into stories. But today, her mind was clouded. Naomi opened her laptop and stared at the blank document on the screen. She had intended to write about the mall incident, to unpack the layers of prejudice and fear she had witnessed. But as her fingers hovered over the keyboard, she found herself hesitating. What exactly had driven that woman to react the way she did? What unspoken fears or past experiences had shaped her into someone so quick to judge? Naomi leaned back in her chair, a thought nagging at the edges of her mind. Prejudice wasn't born in a vacuum. It was nurtured by experiences, upbringing, and societal norms. If she wanted to write something meaningful, she couldn't just focus on the confrontation. She needed to dig deeper. The memory of the woman's flushed face and wavering voice lingered. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," the woman had said, her words laced with an unexpected vulnerability. It was a rare glimpse behind the polished exterior, a crack in the armor that hinted at something more complicated. Naomi decided she needed perspective. She reached for her phone and called her best friend, Clara, a social worker with years of experience dealing with people from all walks of life. "Hey, Clara," Naomi said when her friend picked up. "Got a minute? I need your insight." "For you?" "Always," Clara replied. "What's going on?" Naomi recounted the encounter at the mall, sparing no detail. When she finished, Clara let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's a lot." "Tell me about it," Naomi said. "But here's the thing. I can't stop thinking about what she said. That bit about feeling invisible when she was younger. I feel like there's more to her story, but I don't know how to approach it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Naomi, you're a journalist. You dig into stories for a living. If this is sticking with you, maybe it's worth exploring. People don't wake up one day and decide to be prejudiced. There's always a reason." "But how do I even start?" Naomi asked. "I don't exactly have her phone number." Clara chuckled. "True, but you do have the power of curiosity and empathy. Start there. Write about your experience, but don't frame her as the villain. Frame her as a person with a story worth understanding. Who knows? Maybe she'll see it and reach out." Later that day, Naomi began writing. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she recounted the confrontation in vivid detail. She described the woman's sharp words, the crowd's reaction, and her own struggle to stay composed. But instead of ending the piece with her own victory, Naomi shifted the narrative. She wrote about the woman's vulnerability, her admission of feeling invisible, and the fear that seemed to underpin her actions. Naomi didn't excuse the behavior, but framed it as a symptom of something deeper, an unresolved pain that had festered into prejudice. By the time she finished, the article was raw and honest, equal parts critique and call for understanding. Naomi titled it, "When Fear Shapes Our Actions," a reflection on judgment and humanity. After a quick proofread, she uploaded it to her personal blog and shared the link on her social media accounts. Within hours, the piece began to gain traction. Comments poured in from readers who resonated with Naomi's words. Some shared their own experiences with prejudice, while others reflected on moments when they had been the ones making unfair judgments. The post sparked conversations about fear, empathy, and the unseen struggles that shaped people's perceptions. But amidst the flood of feedback, one message stood out. It was an email, sent late that evening, with the subject line, "An apology and a request." Naomi hesitated before opening the email, her heart pounding with anticipation. The message began with a simple greeting, "Dear Ms. Ellis." As she read on, her breath caught. The email was from the woman at the mall. "I don't know if you'll remember me," it began, "but I was the one who confronted you at the mall yesterday. I saw your article today, and I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I behaved terribly, and your words made me realize how much of my behavior was driven by fear and pain I've never dealt with." Naomi paused, letting the words sink in. The woman continued, describing her childhood in painstaking detail. She had grown up in a struggling immigrant family, constantly feeling judged and excluded. She spoke of the shame she carried from those years and how it had shaped her into someone desperate to distance herself from anything that reminded her of her past. "I'm not proud of who I was yesterday," the email read, "but your article made me want to change. I'm writing to ask if we could meet. I'd like to apologize in person and learn more about how I can do better." Naomi sat back, overwhelmed by the vulnerability in the message. She hadn't expected such a response, let alone an invitation to meet. After a moment's reflection, she typed a reply. "Thank you for your honesty," she wrote. "I'd be willing to meet, but only if you're ready to have an open and honest conversation. Growth isn't easy, but it's worth the effort." 2 days later, Naomi found herself sitting at a small cafe near the mall, her hands wrapped around a mug of steaming tea. The woman arrived a few minutes later, looking markedly different from their first encounter. Gone were the tailored blazer and designer purse. Instead, she wore a simple sweater and jeans, her expression soft and unassuming. "Thank you for meeting me," the woman said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure if you'd even respond." "I wasn't sure if I would either," Naomi admitted. "But I believe in second chances." The woman introduced herself as Lydia, and over the next hour, she shared her story in greater detail. She spoke of the struggles her family had faced, the judgment she had endured, and the bitterness that had grown from years of feeling unseen and underestimated. Naomi listened intently, her notepad resting untouched on the table. When Lydia finished, there was a moment of silence between them. "I'm not excusing what I did," Lydia said finally, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing. Your article opened my eyes to how much harm I've caused, not just to others, but to myself." Naomi nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Change isn't easy, Lydia, but recognizing the problem is the first step. The rest is about what you do moving forward." As they parted ways, Naomi felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Lydia's willingness to confront her own biases gave Naomi hope, a reminder that even the most difficult encounters could lead to growth and understanding. Back at home, Naomi updated her blog with a follow-up post, detailing her meeting with Lydia and the lessons they had both learned. She titled it, "The Power of Listening: A Journey Toward Understanding." The piece went viral within days, sparking even deeper conversations about accountability and empathy. Naomi knew the journey wasn't over, for her, for Lydia, or for the countless others grappling with prejudice. But for the first time in a long time, she felt optimistic. Change, she realized, started with one small, courageous step: bridging the divide. The cafe meeting with Lydia had left Naomi with a curious mix of emotions. She felt hope for the possibility of change, but also a lingering unease about how many others like Lydia remained out there. People hardened by fear and unhealed wounds, spreading their biases in ways that quietly shaped the world. As a writer and a storyteller, Naomi saw an opportunity to do more. It wasn't enough to inspire one person to reflect. She wanted to create a ripple effect, to spark a larger conversation about judgment, understanding, and the barriers we construct. Naomi's next step was to take her reflections public, but this time she aimed higher. Instead of simply posting on her blog, she pitched a series of essays to the Morning Beacon, a well-known online publication that often featured thought-provoking content on social issues. Her proposal outlined a 6-part series titled Bridging the Divide: Stories of Prejudice and Understanding. The essays would delve into real-life stories, including her own experience with Lydia, exploring how assumptions and biases were formed, how they harmed, and how they could be dismantled. To her surprise, the editorial team responded within a day, not only accepting her pitch, but asking her to start immediately. Naomi threw herself into the project, spending hours researching, interviewing, and writing. She reached out to community leaders, psychologists, and ordinary people who had experienced prejudice firsthand. Every story she unearthed added another layer to her understanding of the issue. The first essay in the series, The Weight of Assumptions, was published the following week. It opened with a vivid retelling of her confrontation with Lydia at the mall, but it quickly transitioned into a broader exploration of how assumptions were often the byproduct of fear and ignorance. Naomi included insights from her interviews, weaving in anecdotes from a teacher who had been judged for her accent, a barista who faced daily microaggressions, and a retired police officer who admitted to grappling with his own biases. The response was overwhelming. The comment section exploded with reactions, some supportive, others critical, and many deeply introspective. Readers shared their own stories of being judged or, conversely, moments when they had unfairly judged others. It was exactly the kind of dialogue Naomi had hoped to inspire. But amidst the flood of responses, one email stood out. It was from a local community organization called Crossing Paths, which specialized in fostering dialogue between diverse groups of people. The email was from their founder, Marcus, a charismatic man known for his ability to bring even the most divided groups together. Naomi, the email began, "Your essay hit home for me and for so many others in our community. We've been organizing events to tackle exactly the kind of issues you wrote about, and I'd love to collaborate with you. We're planning a panel discussion next month, and I think your voice would add so much to the conversation. Let me know if you're interested." Naomi read the email twice, her excitement growing with each word. A panel discussion felt like the perfect next step, not just to share her story but to connect with others who were working towards similar goals. She replied immediately, expressing her interest and asking for more details. In the weeks leading up to the panel, Naomi found herself busier than ever. She continued working on her essay series, which had gained a steady following, while also preparing for the event. Marcus and his team at Crossing Paths had planned an ambitious lineup. Community leaders, activists, educators, and even a few individuals who had openly struggled with their own biases. Naomi would be one of the keynote speakers, sharing her story and insights before joining a broader discussion with the panel. On the day of the event, Naomi arrived early at the community center where it was being held. The large hall buzzed with activity as volunteers set up chairs, microphones, and a small stage. Posters with the words "Breaking Barriers," a community conversation lined the walls, and a table near the entrance offered pamphlets and resources for attendees. Naomi felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as she took her seat on the panel. Beside her sat Marcus, whose warm smile instantly put her at ease, along with a teacher, a former police officer, and a college student who had started an anti-bullying initiative on campus. The audience trickled in, filling the room with a diverse mix of faces, young and old, families and individuals, all united by a shared curiosity. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she rose from her seat and approached the podium. The room fell silent, and she took a moment to steady herself before beginning. "I want to start with a story," Naomi said, her voice carrying across the room. "A few weeks ago, I was sitting on a bench at the mall, minding my own business, when a stranger confronted me. She didn't know me, but she made a lot of assumptions about who I was and why I was there. It was an uncomfortable, even painful experience. But it also became the catalyst for something much bigger." She recounted the confrontation with Lydia, the subsequent cafe meeting, and how it had inspired her to dig deeper into the roots of prejudice. As she spoke, Naomi could see the audience's reactions, nodding heads, furrowed brows, and the occasional tear. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. But the real magic happened during the panel discussion that followed. Audience members were invited to share their own experiences and ask questions, and what began as a structured conversation quickly became a raw and heartfelt exchange. A young woman spoke about being judged for wearing a hijab. An older man admitted to harboring biases he wasn't proud of and asked how he could start unlearning them. A high school teacher described an initiative she had started to foster inclusivity in her classroom. Naomi listened, her heart swelling with a mix of sadness and hope. The stories shared that night were a stark reminder of how much work remained to be done, but they also underscored the power of honest, open dialogue. By the end of the night, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. As the audience began to disperse, she found herself surrounded by people eager to thank her, share their thoughts, or simply connect. Among them was Lydia. Naomi blinked in surprise as Lydia approached, a small bouquet of flowers in hand. "I heard about this event and thought I should come," Lydia said, her voice soft but steady. "You've inspired me more than you know, and I wanted to show my support." Naomi accepted the flowers with a smile, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Lydia. It means a lot that you're here." As they spoke, Naomi realized just how far Lydia had come since their initial encounter. She wasn't the same defensive, judgmental woman Naomi had met at the mall. She was someone who had chosen to face her fears, to unlearn harmful patterns, and to build bridges instead of walls. In the days that followed, Naomi reflected on the event and its impact. The dialogue it had sparked felt like a small but meaningful step toward a more understanding world. She continued her essay series, but now she felt an even greater responsibility to use her platform for change. The third essay, titled "The Courage to Change," chronicled the panel discussion and the stories shared that night. It highlighted the importance of creating spaces where people could confront their biases without fear of judgment, a theme Naomi felt more passionate about than ever. As the essay went live, Naomi received an email from Marcus. "That was just the beginning," he wrote. "Let's keep the momentum going." Naomi smiled, knowing he was right. The work of breaking barriers and fostering understanding was far from over. But with every story told, every conversation sparked, and every heart changed, she felt a little closer to the world she dreamed of. A world where people saw each other not as stereotypes, but as individuals, flawed and beautiful, worthy of respect. The anatomy of prejudice. The days after the panel discussion brought a whirlwind of activity into Naomi's life. Her essay series for the Morning Beacon continued to gain traction, with each new installment sparking fresh debates, conversations, and reflections. Emails poured in from readers across the country, teachers using her essays in classrooms, parents sharing them with their children, and even a few corporate leaders seeking advice on fostering inclusivity within their organizations. But for Naomi, the work was far from over. While the responses had been overwhelmingly positive, there were also detractors, emails and comments laced with anger, denial, and defensiveness. Some accused her of exaggerating the issues, while others dismissed her experiences as isolated incidents. Naomi had expected this. Tackling topics as complex and uncomfortable as prejudice often unearthed resistance. One comment in particular stuck with her. "People like you always make this about race." Maybe the woman at the mall was just having a bad day. The dismissiveness of the statement stung, but it also reminded Naomi of how deeply ingrained denial could be. People often avoided confronting their own biases by rationalizing them or shifting the blame. Naomi decided it was time to delve deeper into the roots of prejudice, not just its effects, but the mechanisms that kept it alive. Naomi reached out to Dr. Evelyn Hart, a psychologist and professor specializing in the psychology of bias and prejudice. Dr. Hart was well known for her research on implicit bias and had written extensively about how societal structures and personal experiences shaped people's perceptions. "I read your essays," Dr. Hart said warmly when Naomi called her. "You've got a way of making these issues accessible to everyday people. What can I do for you?" Naomi explained her intention to write an essay that explored the psychology behind prejudice. "I want to understand why people like Lydia, and honestly, all of us, fall into these patterns of judgment. How do these biases form, and why are they so hard to unlearn?" Dr. Hart nodded thoughtfully. "That's a big question, but it's an important one. Prejudice is a learned behavior, Naomi. It starts early, often without people even realizing it. Children absorb messages about race, class, gender, and other differences from their environment. Parents, schools, media. These messages form the foundation of implicit biases, which are unconscious associations we carry with us." Naomi jotted down notes furiously as Dr. Hart spoke. "But here's the thing," Dr. Hart continued. "Biases aren't inherently evil. They're a byproduct of how our brains work. The human brain is wired to categorize. It's a survival mechanism. The problem arises when those categories become rigid and when the stereotypes we associate with them go unchallenged. That's when bias turns into prejudice. The conversation left Naomi with a clearer understanding of the issue, but also a greater sense of responsibility. If biases were natural but harmful when unchecked, then the real challenge lay in education and awareness. She decided to dedicate her fourth essay to unraveling the anatomy of prejudice, breaking it down in a way that anyone could understand. Titled Why We Judge: The Science of Bias and Prejudice, the essay was structured into 3 sections. How biases form. Naomi began by explaining Dr. Hart's insights about the brain's categorization process. She described how children as young as 3 could internalize stereotypes, often from subtle cues in their environment. She cited examples from her research, such as studies showing that children assigned higher value to dolls that looked like them, or how media often portrayed certain groups in limited roles. The impact of bias. The second section delved into the consequences of unchecked biases. Naomi wove in real-life stories she'd collected during her interviews. A Black woman denied a promotion despite her qualifications, an immigrant family subjected to constant scrutiny in their neighborhood, and a teenager bullied for his gender expression. Each story illustrated how implicit biases, left unchallenged, could manifest as systemic discrimination or personal harm. Unlearning prejudice. The final section offered hope and solutions. Naomi shared strategies for identifying and dismantling biases, including self-reflection, exposure to diverse perspectives, and open dialogue. She emphasized that unlearning prejudice was a lifelong process, but one that could lead to personal growth and stronger communities. The essay went live on a Friday morning, and by noon, Naomi's inbox was flooded once again. This time, the messages were different. Many came from people who admitted to recognizing their own biases for the first time. One email read, "I never thought of myself as prejudiced, but your essay made me realize how often I make snap judgments about people. I'm going to start paying more attention to my assumptions and where they come from. Thank you for opening my eyes." Another wrote, "My son came home from school last week upset because a classmate called him a slur. I shared your essay with him, and we talked about why people behave the way they do. It was a tough conversation, but it brought us closer." Naomi was deeply moved by these responses, but the one that stood out the most came from a high school teacher in a small town. "I've been teaching history for 20 years, the email began, but I've never felt equipped to address the biases my students bring into the classroom. Your essay gave me a framework to start those conversations. Thank you for giving me the tools to make a difference." Buoyed by the positive feedback, Naomi decided to take her work a step further. She reached out to Marcus at Crossing Paths and pitched an idea, a workshop series for educators, community leaders, and parents, designed to help them identify and address biases in their spheres of influence. "Let's do it," Marcus said without hesitation. "This is exactly the kind of work we need to be doing." Together, they developed a pilot program called Unlearning Together, which combined lectures, interactive exercises, and group discussions. Naomi would lead sessions on storytelling as a tool for empathy, while Marcus would focus on practical strategies for fostering inclusivity. The first workshop was held in a local library, drawing a small but engaged crowd. Naomi felt a nervous thrill as she stood at the front of the room, armed with a projector and a stack of handouts. As she began to speak, she realized just how far she had come since that fateful day at the mall. By the end of the workshop, attendees were brimming with ideas and questions. A middle-aged woman approached Naomi, her eyes brimming with tears. "I've spent my whole life feeling invisible," she said. "Hearing you speak today made me realize I don't have to stay that way. I can use my voice to help others see the value in themselves and in people who are different from them." Naomi squeezed the woman's hand, her own eyes misting. "That's exactly why I'm here," she said. "We all have the power to change the narrative. One story, one conversation at a time. As Naomi packed up her materials that evening, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The work was hard, often uncomfortable, but it was worth every moment. The conversation had begun, and Naomi was determined to keep it going. One essay, one workshop, and one courageous step at a time. Ripples of change. The success of the Unlearning Together workshops was beyond anything Naomi had expected. What had started as a small initiative to spark conversation had grown into a movement. Marcus and his team at Crossing Paths reported a surge of interest from schools, community centers, and even businesses eager to host their sessions. Naomi found herself busier than ever, traveling to different venues, meeting people from all walks of life, and learning just as much as she taught. But amidst the growing momentum, Naomi couldn't ignore the emotional toll the work was taking on her. Each story she heard, from the single mother facing daily prejudice at work to the teenager bullied for being different, added another layer to the weight she carried. She reminded herself why she had started this journey, but there were moments when the burden felt almost too much to bear. One evening, after a particularly intense workshop, Naomi sat alone in her small apartment, scrolling through the emails that had flooded her inbox. Among the usual mix of praise and criticism, one message caught her attention. It was from a man named Jonathan, and the subject line read, "A perspective from the other side." Naomi hesitated before opening it, bracing herself for the possibility of hostility. But as she read, she was surprised by the tone of the message. "Naomi," it began, "I've been following your work for the past few months, and I wanted to reach out. I'll be honest, I've been the kind of person you've written about, the one who judges others without knowing them, the one who dismisses conversations about bias as woke nonsense. But your essays have made me stop and think about why I am the way I am. I grew up in a household where certain beliefs were just accepted as truth. It's taken me years to realize how much those beliefs have shaped me, and not in a good way. I'm trying to change, but it's hard to unlearn things that feel so deeply rooted. I don't know if you'll respond, but I just wanted to thank you for making me think. For the first time, I feel like there's hope for someone like me." Naomi read the email twice, her emotions swirling. She had received messages like this before, but something about Jonathan's vulnerability struck a chord. His words were a reminder that change wasn't just for the victims of prejudice, but also for those who perpetuated it, often unknowingly. Naomi decided to reply. She thanked Jonathan for his honesty and encouraged him to keep questioning his assumptions, no matter how uncomfortable it might feel. She also invited him to attend one of her workshops, hoping he might find a supportive space to continue his journey. To her surprise, Jonathan wrote back the next day. "Thank you for responding," he said. "I'd like to attend a workshop, but I'm nervous. What if people judge me for the things I've thought or said in the past?" Naomi understood his fear. She had seen it before in others who were beginning to confront their biases. "You're not alone," she replied. "The fact that you're willing to do the work says a lot. Come as you are, and let's start from there." Jonathan attended his first workshop a week later. Naomi spotted him immediately, a tall, unassuming man in his early 40s, standing near the back of the room with his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked out of place, his nervous energy palpable. Naomi made a point to introduce herself before the session began, offering a warm smile that seemed to ease his tension. The workshop that day focused on identifying implicit biases. Naomi started with an exercise that asked participants to reflect on their first impressions of different images: a man in a suit, a woman in a hijab, a teenager with tattoos. As the group shared their thoughts, Naomi guided the conversation, helping them recognize how their assumptions were shaped by cultural narratives and personal experiences. Jonathan stayed quiet for most of the session, but when Naomi asked for volunteers to share their reflections, he hesitated before raising his hand. "I've realized something today," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I've spent so much of my life making snap judgments about people, assuming things about them based on how they look, where they're from, or what they believe. I didn't question those judgments because they felt normal, like breathing. But now I see how much harm those assumptions have caused, not just to others, but to me too. They've kept me from seeing people as they really are. The room was silent as Jonathan spoke, his vulnerability touching everyone present. When he finished, a few participants nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Naomi felt a surge of pride, not just in Jonathan, but in the environment they had created together, one where honesty and growth were possible. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan became a regular at the workshops. He often stayed behind to ask Naomi questions or share his reflections, each conversation revealing more of his journey. Naomi learned that he was a single father raising 2 young daughters, and that his desire to change was driven, in part, by them. "I don't want my girls growing up with the same blinders I had," he admitted one evening. "I want them to see the world, and the people in it, with open eyes and open hearts." Jonathan's story became a powerful example of the ripple effect Naomi had always hoped to create. As he worked to unlearn his biases, he began to influence those around him, from his daughters to his coworkers. He even started a book club focused on exploring diverse perspectives, inviting friends and neighbors to join him in the journey. Inspired by Jonathan's transformation, Naomi decided to make him the focus of her 5th essay, titled "The Courage to Confront Yourself." The piece chronicled his journey from resistance to growth. She wrote about his initial doubts, the moments of clarity he experienced in the workshops, and his determination to create a better future for his daughters. But she also used his story to address a broader audience, challenging readers to reflect on their own biases and consider the impact of their assumptions. The essay was Naomi's most personal yet, and it resonated deeply with her audience. Readers flooded her inbox with messages of gratitude and reflection. Some admitted to seeing themselves in Jonathan, while others expressed hope that his story might inspire someone in their own lives to change. One email stood out, a message from a woman who wrote, "I shared your essay with my husband, who's always been dismissive of conversations about prejudice. After reading it, he turned to me and said, 'Maybe I've been wrong.' We stayed up late talking about things we've never discussed before. Thank you for giving us a place to start." As Naomi read the email, she felt the weight she had been carrying begin to lift. The work was still hard, and the journey was far from over. But stories like Jonathan's reminded her why it mattered. Every conversation, every workshop, every essay had the power to change hearts and minds, and in doing so, to change the world. Naomi closed her laptop, a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: the ripples they were creating together would keep spreading, touching lives in ways she could only begin to imagine. A new narrative. The momentum of Naomi's work had grown beyond what she ever imagined. What began as a confrontation in a shopping mall had sparked a movement that reached into schools, community centers, workplaces, and homes. Her workshops had expanded to include digital sessions, drawing participants from across the country, and her essay series was now a cornerstone of the Morning Beacon's editorial lineup. People from all walks of life were engaging in conversations they had once avoided, and Naomi found herself at the center of it all. Despite the success, Naomi knew the work was far from finished. Every step forward revealed more barriers to break, more biases to confront, and more hearts to reach. But she also knew that change wasn't about grand gestures or quick solutions. It was about persistence, resilience, and the willingness to take one small step at a time. One morning, Naomi received a phone call from Marcus. His voice crackled with excitement. "Naomi, you're not going to believe this," he said. "We've been invited to present at the National Diversity and Inclusion Summit next month. They want us to share the Unlearning Together model as a blueprint for other communities." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. The summit was a prestigious event, attended by thought leaders, policymakers, and activists from around the world. The opportunity to present their work on such a platform was both thrilling and daunting. "That's incredible," Naomi said, her voice tinged with nervous energy. "But do you really think we're ready for something like this?" Marcus laughed. "Are you kidding? We were born ready. This is exactly the kind of audience we need to reach. Plus, you've been the heart of this movement, Naomi. Your voice deserves to be heard on a stage like this." Naomi agreed, though the weight of the task ahead loomed large. Over the next few weeks, she and Marcus worked tirelessly to prepare their presentation. They combed through data, gathered testimonials, and created a compelling narrative that showcased the impact of their work. Naomi also spent hours rehearsing her speech, determined to do justice to the stories of the people they had helped. The day of the summit arrived, and Naomi stood backstage, her palms damp with nervous anticipation. The conference center buzzed with activity, the air charged with the energy of thousands of attendees. Marcus gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You've got this," he said. "Just speak from the heart, like you always do." Naomi nodded, taking a deep breath as her name was called. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the audience, a sea of faces, all watching her with rapt attention. "Good afternoon," Naomi began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Today, I want to tell you a story, not just about what we've done, but about why we've done it, and why it matters." She began with the moment that started it all, the confrontation with Lydia at the mall. Naomi spoke about the fear and judgment that had filled that encounter, but also about the vulnerability and courage that had followed. She shared Lydia's journey, Jonathan's transformation, and the countless stories of people who had found a way to unlearn their biases and rebuild their understanding of the world. As Naomi spoke, the room fell silent, her words resonating deeply with the audience. She painted a picture of a world where prejudice wasn't inevitable, where change was possible, and where every small act of courage contributed to a greater ripple of transformation. "We all carry biases," Naomi said, her voice firm but compassionate. "They're part of being human. But we also have the power to confront them, to challenge the narratives we've been given, and to create new ones. The question isn't whether we'll make mistakes, it's whether we'll have the courage to learn from them." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Naomi felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her as she stepped back from the podium. Marcus joined her on stage, his smile wide and proud. "We're just getting started," he whispered as they walked off stage. The summit was a turning point for Naomi and her work. In the weeks that followed, they received invitations from organizations and communities eager to adopt the Unlearning Together model. Schools implemented bias awareness programs based on her workshops, corporations revamped their diversity training, and activists used her essays as tools for advocacy. But perhaps the most unexpected impact was the way Naomi's work began to influence policy. Inspired by her essays, a group of lawmakers introduced a bill aimed at funding educational initiatives to combat systemic prejudice. Naomi was invited to testify before Congress, where she shared her experiences and called for action to address the root causes of discrimination. "It's not enough to hope for change," Naomi told the committee. "We have to invest in it. We have to create spaces where people can confront their biases, learn from their mistakes, and grow together. That's how we build a better future." Amidst the whirlwind of public appearances and growing recognition, Naomi never lost sight of the small personal moments that had always driven her work. She continued to lead workshops, often sitting with participants long after the sessions ended to hear their stories and answer their questions. She maintained a steady stream of essays, each one delving deeper into the complexities of human connection and understanding. One evening, after a particularly emotional workshop, Naomi received an unexpected visitor, Lydia. It had been months since their last meeting, and Lydia looked different, lighter, somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I just wanted to thank you," Lydia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not just for what you did for me, but for what you've done for so many others. You've changed my life, Naomi, and you've inspired me to do the same for others." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. The change was yours, Lydia. I just gave you a place to start. As the months turned into years, Naomi's work continued to grow, touching lives in ways she could never have anticipated. She published a book, Ripples of Change, chronicling her journey and the stories of the people she had met along the way. The book became a bestseller, sparking conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms around the world. But for Naomi, the true measure of success wasn't in the accolades or the recognition. It was in the quiet moments, the email from a father who had learned to see his son in a new light, the conversation with a student who had found the courage to stand up for a friend, the workshop participant who had realized they were capable of change. Naomi knew the work would never be finished. Prejudice was a deeply rooted problem, and dismantling it required constant effort. But she also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. In the end, it wasn't about erasing prejudice. It was about creating a new narrative, one where people saw each other not as enemies or strangers, but as fellow human beings, flawed and beautiful, striving to build a better world together. And as Naomi sat down to write her next essay, she felt a deep sense of hope. The ripples they had started were still spreading, and she was ready to keep pushing them forward, one story, one conversation, one courageous step at a time.